of Humanities and Social Sciences. Utah State University is the land-grant university. Oops, hold on one sec. Utah State University is the land-grant university for the state of Utah and resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands in Willow Valley of the northwestern band of the Shoshone Nation. I'm Jennifer Duncan, and while I'm currently the interim dean of libraries, my real day job is as the curator who oversees our special collections books. Also joining us tonight as a part of the Eating the Past team are Tammy Proctor, professor of history, and Jonah Bebo, currently a PhD student at the University of Nevada, Reno, and a former USU history graduate student who serves as our production coordinator. As a reminder, our Zoom series focuses on recipes taken from and inspired by cookbook collections at the Utah State University Special Collections and Archives, which we use not only to document the history of the Intermountain West, but also to provide broader primary source literacy through the study of foodways and culinary history. All previous events have been posted to a library guide, and either if Jonah or Tammy, if one of you guys could grab the link and post that now in the chat, anybody can go back and grab the previous episodes, the book information, and the recipes at your convenience. And we'll be posting this video as well as these recipes after this show. On that guide, you will also find a link to our new Eating the Past radio show, which is sponsored by Utah Public Radio and hosted by the History Department faculty and staff, Tammy Proctor, Jamie Sanders, and Jeannie Sir. The radio show runs at Sunday at noon, right before the Splendid Table. So tonight, I'm super excited about tonight. We're going to be traveling to Italy, and we're going to be considering the question of pizza through two very different historical lenses. We will be hearing from two Utah State University scholars, both in the Department of History. First up will be Alex Bullock-Reese, a recent graduate of the Ancient Languages and Cultures Master's Degree Program, and her mentor, Dr. Mark Damen, who's a professor of classics. Alex and Mark will be talking about ancient Roman cooking, which Alex discussed in her recent thesis. Then Dr. Daniel McInerney, Emeritus Professor of History, will join us to jump forward several hundred centuries to discuss Sicilian pizza as filtered through the Italian-American experience. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And Tammy, if we can get the slides going, I'll introduce the first collection materials related to tonight's presentation. Okay, so tonight, Alex and Mark will be preparing an interesting flatbread dish inspired by Marcus Cato's, and everybody just needs to excuse my foreign language here with the Latin and the Italian. Alex and Mark are going to be preparing an interesting flatbread dish inspired by Marcus Cato's De Agricultura. USU's Special Collections does hold a copy of this work. It's bound into an edition of Scripturas Rei Rusticae. This is a collection of the writings of 4 agricultural writers frequently reprinted during the Renaissance, and we believe our edition to be circa 1521, although the first known printing of this work is 1482. Our copy has been rebound in 17th century red Morocco leather and is heavily gilded on the cover, spine, and edges. Next slide. Oops, great. This particular volume, our copy, includes the armorial bookplate of the Earl of Cromer on the first paste down in paper and markings of the Althorp Library of the Earl of Spencer on the verso of the front free in paper, and a handwritten note indicating that it was, quote, purchased at the sale of Sunderland Library, March 1883. This beautiful item was purchased for us from a bookseller in 2011 as a gift from the Friends of the Merrill Kazir Library. Next slide. Now, in case you don't read Latin as fluently as Alex and Mark, I do want to call your attention to a fun little item in our folklore cookbook collections, The Fine Art of Roman Cooking by Dr. Alexander Lenard. Dr. Lenard has a very interesting history. He escaped Austria from Rome during the Nazi occupation, and he was active in Italy in the Italian resistance. In 1952, he immigrated to Brazil, where he practiced medicine and served as a translator for medical congresses. Next slide. But many of you with an interest in the Latin language will know him as the person with the only bestseller in Latin during the 20th century, Winnie Il Pu, which was actually first published in Brazil in the early 1960s. Now, the recipes in his Roman cookbook are far from authentic, but they were inspired by ancient Rome, And more importantly, for most of us here in the audience, they are in English with ingredients that are readily available at the local grocery store in case you want to explore the Austrian, Italian, Brazilian twist on this topic. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alex and Mark so they can tell us something about Cato's version of pizza.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that awesome introduction. So we were looking for an ancient Roman pizza, and we found 2 recipes that got pretty close to something pizza-like.
But before we get to the recipes, we want to provide you with a little overview of what dining was like in antiquity.
In the ancient world, calories were the name of the game. It was imperative to meet one's minimum daily calorie requirements each day. While food instability is still a very real and dire problem today, the fear of food instability and famine is not nearly on the societal level as it was in antiquity. Given that, meals were typically as calorically dense as possible, and much of the food was very heavy with staple ingredients such as cheese, flour or bread, olive oil, and wine. All of these provided many more calories in smaller amounts of food than, say,
asparagus, Cheetos.
This means that nutritionally, Romans were much more focused on macronutrients versus micronutrients. In a nutshell, macronutrients are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Micronutrients are things like calcium, vitamin C, iron, zinc, the B vitamins, etc. The best way to get a varied array and high quantity of micronutrients is through fresh fruit and vegetables, which were harder to come by in antiquity. That said, the Roman diet was heavy on bread, enabling them to get plenty of carbohydrates in, olive oil as a source of fat, and cheese, which is a good source of fat and protein.
So these 2 recipes do not represent an overview of the entire Roman diet, do they?
No, but they do provide an example of the type of pizza-like fare one might expect. Next slide, please, Tammy. As a note on the recipes, these were both adapted from Mark Grant's Roman Cookery because recipes in ancient Rome were not terribly specific. For example, our first recipe, the staititai, is reprinted for you here in full with the Loeb translation. The staititai, a type of cake made from spelt flour, dough, and honey. Epicharmus mentions them in the wedding of Hebe, always a teacher. Moist spelt flour dough is poured out into a frying pan, and honey, sesame seeds, and cheese are added on top of it, according to Iatropolis. Let's see. In fact, most of the recipes in antiquity are similar in their brevity and lack of precise instruction. This recipe comes from Othonius's Deipnosophistae, which has been translated as the learned banqueters, though I prefer a translation I saw once that was the partying professors.
Woohoo! That sounds like a blast. Just kidding.
This is a work that comes from the early 3rd century and is quite long, containing the events of a fictional dinner party that Othonius relates to his friend Timocrates. The banquet features many historical and fictitious characters engaging in a dialogue with one another, as well as many recipes in detail. As this took place at a high status party, even including the famous ancient Dr. Galen as a guest, these recipes are likely the sort which wealthy upper class Romans would have enjoyed.
As opposed to the average guy on the Via Appia, huh?
Our version of the staititai uses spelt flour and feta cheese. It turned out more like a fry bread than a typical flatbread and was immensely filling. It was pretty good. The honey on top really made it for me.
Me too. Let's watch it.
So what's the first that you want to start with?
Let's start with the staititai.
So the first recipe we're going to make is a staititai, which is a sort of Roman flatbread, but it's the closest to a pizza we could find. All right, okay, so now we've activated our yeast for the staititai, and we're going to mix it in with spelt flour to make our dough, which we're then going to let rise for about an hour.
Yep.
And go from there. Yeast and the flour. Really, the dough for this, you want to be more of a wet dough than otherwise. I think I can just turn it out and like work it on this surface too. That would probably be a little easier to like incorporate.
Here, let me see. Let's get this around here. There we go.
Yeah.
I do a lot
There
of
you
bread
go.
baking, and I got to tell you, it's like students. You just got to treat it a little brutally, and then it works.
I don't know anything about that.
Don't put that in the thing. Okay. All right. So here we go. So now we've got that. There we go.
Okay.
So now
And now we're gonna need probably another. Well, I guess we could just put it back in the bowl and cover the bowl. I
okay.
think. Yeah.
Or we could just put another bag. Do you want to?
I don't care.
Okay.
Whichever.
Let's go for another bag. Just because they're sitting right here. Okay.
And we'll probably want to put this one by the oven because it wants to. This one we're proving, not chilling.
Okay. Okay. So we're just going to keep it out here.
Yeah. Keep it close,
Okay.
close to the warmth. Okay, so now we've got our staititai dough, which we've proofed for an hour. And what we're actually going to do is separate it into two and then shape those into our disc shapes for the flatbread base and let them proof again for another half an hour. So what I'm going to do is just basically cut this into two with a knife. And then we're just going to make it into two little discs. What do you think about your consistency? How thick do you want it?
Well, let's make it nice and thick so it holds together.
Okay.
That looks good. And so are we going to want little bags to put that in?
Yeah.
Okay. So I brought out two little
Oh,
bags
perfect.
here.
Let's see if this is a little thin.
Okay.
Okay, now they're.
Do this. And so there we go.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Okay, little bag number one. Little bag number two.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're gonna fry the staititai. I don't think the Romans used plastic. That's my theory.
Probably not.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna take this out.
Yeah, and put it on the tray.
Okay. And then we're going to,
Just top them with feta, honey, and sesame seeds.
well, you can do
Okay.
that. I will let you do
Okay, perfect. All right.
So now we're going to do what?
Now we're gonna flash it in the oven just so that the cheese melts, and then we should be pretty much done.
Okay, so we're gonna put it on broil.
Broil.
Okay,
yes.
given the power of my oven though, I'm gonna put it on a lighter broil just so that we do not burn everything down here.
Thanks. The second recipe we made is the placenta from Cato the Elder's De Agricultura. Born in 234 BCE, Cato was from the city of Tusculum in the Alban Hills, which housed many villas of wealthy Romans. Cato wrote De Agricultura as a sort of handbook for his son and others to use in managing their own villas. He includes a calendar of the year's tasks, inventories, instructions for sewing, how to best recycle items, and instructions for ceremonial recipes and sacrifices. Dr. Damen, you're muted.
Not to mention how to beat the most work out of pretty much everyone around you.
Next slide, please. It is of note that even in rural life, a ceremonial recipe still focused on caloric density because the countryside is where Romans had the best access to fresh fruit and vegetables.
They got the micronutrients from that, so they were more focused on the macros, right?
Yeah, many villas had large gardens or fields that could support the household, and food did not need to be imported, as it did so often in the city of Rome. In my own work, I argue that the satires 5 and 11 of Juvenal illustrate just that rural fare is far more nutritious than what the city could easily provide.
So, all in all, the placenta described in Cato's work was used for ceremonial purposes and celebrations in the household and could feed a pretty big crowd.
Yeah, the original recipe is for a 6-pound placenta, which Grant thankfully reduces to smaller individual portion sizes. Note that fresh produce is not included as an ingredient. The dish itself has more structure to it than what we might consider a pizza today. In fact, I think it resembles something more like a layered calzone.
Or a baseball.
Next slide, please. You'll see that there are many alternating layers of cheese and pastry. Some scholars have argued that this dish is a precursor to the baklava due to these layers, but whether that's true or not, I think it raises the horrible possibility that the pizza was preceded by the calzone.
Shocking. Let's watch while we make a placenta. And what man has ever said those words before?
Well, that was the Staititai. What's next?
Next, we're going to be making a placenta, which is essentially a mix between a calzone and a baklava. In fact, some scholars even argued that it is the precursor to the baklava.
Well, let's get to it.
So now we're just making our wholemeal flour dough. This is going to form the outside of the placenta, and it's kind of a harder crust that goes around your cheese and pastry filling. It is a little hard to form, so like typically I add a little bit more water than the recipe calls for. Thanks, Cato.
Cato had slaves to work it.
Yeah, seriously.
So, but the point is, when we see the proper texture, you'll know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's definitely more of a dry dough than a wet dough.
And without yeast, you're not going to have any rising on this, right?
Right. I'm just going to work it into a ball. Wow, this is a lot better than you giving me homework.
How do you know the homework isn't coming? When there's teachers around, there's always the threat of a quiz.
So now we need to put this in the fridge for an hour and let it chill.
Is it open, or do we put?
I put mine in a plastic bag, which was a
Okay.
necessity in a Roman kitchen.
Yes, right. I was going to say this nice Roman.
So now we're just going to make the white flour dough for the placenta, and this is actually going to go on the inside, and the wholemeal dough is going to wrap around it. Basically, it's just flour, water, and olive oil. You guessed it. Okay. I need to grab this olive oil, huh? And this dough, again, will be more dry, more of like a pastry. The goal is to get it to something like a phyllo dough. So we'll see if we can achieve that.
That's great. I love Philo.
You're definitely going to want to flour your surface with this dough, or else it will stick to it. And then really what you want to do is just roll it as thin as possible. Are you good at rolling out?
Okay, okay. You're gonna get me to
Really
roll?
don't wanna.
Okay, okay. I'm the
so
roller here. Okay.
And so the goal is to just roll it as thin as possible, and then we're gonna cut this into actually little squares, and then layer the squares with the cheese, and that will be the inner filling of our placenta. Then what I kind of did is I kind of like trimmed up the edges of mine,
Yeah.
and then I think, yeah, we'll just go like this.
Okay. And then we're gonna let these dry?
Yeah, so we're gonna leave them out to let them dry for about 30 minutes.
Okay.
So now we're gonna prep the filling for the placenta, which is feta cheese and honey and then a little bit of salt. So we're just gonna wanna mash that so that it's a nice consistency that we can spread on our squares here. That's 2 tablespoons of honey. Use my finger.
Here we go.
I'm gonna get honey.
I'll
all
take
over.
that. There you go.
Okay. And half a teaspoon of salt. Your feta's already gonna be kind of salty, so go light on it. And then, yeah, you just want to mash that together. So now we've prepped our wholemeal flour dough, has chilled for about an hour, and we've dried our white flour and we've prepped our cheese. So what we're going to do now is essentially cut this in half and roll it out into 2 essentially crusts that we're going to put all of the filling inside of. Now we've assembled the structure of the placenta, and we'll need to wrap that wholemeal dough around, and apparently the goal is to sort of like pinch it at the top like it's a rosebud about to open. So I guess sort of like a little sack. And the placentas that Cato would have eaten were actually 6 pounds in weight. So this is the mini version of our little, it kind of looks nice.
There we go.
All right.
It's not a Cato, it's a Catullus, the diminutive.
Perfect.
So,
Okay, perfect. So now we're gonna pop these in the oven for about 40 minutes, and we'll see how they turn out.
okay.
Okay.
Well, here we have it.
Here we have it. Yeah.
Statitae and placenta,
Yep,
right?
Absolutely.
Okay, and as you were saying, we're getting a lot of carbs here.
A lot of carbs. A lot
Right.
of carbs. Yeah, cheese and carbs, a very balanced meal.
So, well, that just means we can do a lot of exercise afterwards.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Build a wall or something.
Yeah,
Something
look,
Roman.
something like that.
Yes. Okay,
All right.
so shall we dig in? Here's to conquering the world.
Cheers.
Well, thanks, guys. That was really amazing. I'm a big fan of the Great British Baking Show, and I'm just imagining Paul Hollywood suggesting the placenta as a technical challenge, and all of their faces looking very perplexed in terms of what the heck is this placenta they're talking about. That was really remarkable. Thank you so much. Okay, we are going to transition. Next up, we have Dr. Daniel McInerney, who will be talking to us about how pizza has been differently interpreted over time, particularly in the United States. He's going to be focusing on a regional recipe from Sicily using a modified version of Ada Boni's San Vito pizza. And Dan, I'm going to limit my attempts at Italian here, although I may have to say a couple of words. So you're just going to have to forgive me. Ada Boni authored the 1928 Il Talismano della Felicità, which was essentially the joy of cooking for Italian housewives. Although the actual translation into English is something like the Talisman of Happiness. And you can see a copy of that book here on this slide. It was published in the United States in the 1950s as the Talisman Italian Cookbook. Our collection item from which Dan has modified a recipe is Italian regional cooking. And we have a 1969 English translated edition, which is housed in our Pristini Design collection. And that's kind of what I want to focus on right now. Our Pristini Design collection contains over 8,000 items drawn from the personal library of Dr. James Pristini, and it focuses on visual media and design. Pristini was from an Italian immigrant family from Waterford, Connecticut, and he graduated from Yale. And he ended up being on the faculty at the University of California at Berkeley, where he was instrumental to opening the Design Laboratory for Architecture and Design. The Catherine Kane Wanless Foundation purchased this collection for the library here at USU, along with the personal papers of Pristini, which are also housed in our repository. This cookbook, it is truly beautiful. It's so richly produced with hundreds of photographs that capture the beauty of Italy and its food. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about his pizza.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and to all the people who put these programs together. This has been so enjoyable. Next. The topic of pizza is just wonderful for a wonderful subject for a history department to talk about, because the food item is such a wonderful reflection of one of the main themes of historical study, the way in which we examine change over time. Now, that can be something as silly as the changing logos of Pizza Hut, but it also focuses on the changing nature of food preparation and the kind of the desires of those who are trying to not simply recreate, but to revision food items. Although I must say, after watching the first part of this program, there's one example of continuity over time, and that is the attention to what Mark called caloric density. I love that phrase, and we'll be getting more into that next. Jennifer showed me several books from special collections. One in the top left here is a work from Time Life Books in 1968. What this work does is to create this unified picture of Italian cooking, the cooking of all of Italy, as if it's some kind of singular subject, a kind of macro recipe book. On the lower right, a kind of micro history. This is another book in special collections that looks at one family's memories about cooking within their own home. Next. Another theme, though, in Italian cooking and in Italian cookbooks has been advanced by Ada Boni, Marcella Hazan, and Lydia Bastianich. And that's the quest for authenticity in Italian foods, trying to grasp once again how actual Italians in actual areas of Italy were creating major classic traditional dishes in their homes and in their towns and villages. Next. As Jennifer noted, Ada Boni, whose first major cookbook was produced quite early in the 20th century, came out with this 1969 work. And the title is the key here, not just Italian cooking, as in the Time Life book, but Italian regional cooking. Her book is divided into a number of sections that tries to recapture authentic recipes from Italian regions. Next. In her discussion of Sicily, Boney gives a recipe for the type of pizza that serves as kind of the origin of what we think of as Sicilian pizza here in the United States, a dish called sfincione. And this sfincione di San Vito is often discussed as one of the origin points of Sicilian pizza. Sfincione is a common street food in Sicily, especially in Palermo, but in many other cities too. It's not flat like a Neapolitan pizza. It's a thick pizza, but it's kind of light and spongy. It's usually served in squares, not triangles. And as you see, the ingredients are pretty simple. Dough, olive oil, tomatoes, onion, salt and pepper, sardines or anchovies, caciocavallo cheese, and sometimes breadcrumbs placed on top. Well, 3 issues with Boney's work. Number one, she says she's looking at Italian regional cooking. There are 20 regions in Italy. She only covers 16 of them. 4 are left out of the book. Problem number 2, is this actually Sfincione di San Vito? Next. This is what Boney's recipe comes out, how it comes out of the oven, looking like this square of spongy, light, risen, focaccia-like dough topped with tomatoes and other toppings. Next. Many argue this, in fact, is a San Vito sfincione, something that, once again, looks more like a calzone. It's not just simple ingredients. There's also rich ingredients in this pizza. Meat, a variety of vegetables, all kinds of items stuffed in here. It dates back to the middle of the 17th century, to nuns in a monastery in Palermo who prepared this for an audience of noblemen and clergy. This was not a common street food. This was quite uncommon because of its richness. What the common folk were left with is the pizza on top. But that's what Boney creates, but what you see on the bottom is actually Sfincione di San Vito. Next. Another problem with Boney's book. What kind of Sfincione from Sicily is she talking about? If you go to the Sfincione festival in Bagheria, you find a white pizza, a Sfincione bianco. It doesn't have tomatoes. Next. If you go west to Palermo, to its Sfincione festival, you find both the rosso Sfincione with tomatoes, and you also find the bianco pizza. Next. And if you go to the town in between the two of them, Figarazzi, you'll find perhaps the most ecumenical celebration of Sfincione. They'll include just about anything, which is the story of Sicily. There's no one Sfincione in this region. There are multiple versions. Next. And that leads me to another trend in the story of Italian foods, especially one marked by this scholar. He's not a chef. He's a professor at the Institute of Gastronomic Studies in Pollenza in Italy, Simone Cinotto. And in 2013, he came out with this book, The Italian-American an Italian-American examination of food and family and community in New York City. It's a study of the way in which immigrants took on all of this cooking. And what he argues is not a theme of the unity of Italian cooking. It's not a drive for what others have sought, this authenticity. What he sees in in the kitchens of immigrants to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century is a story of fragmentation, adaptation, and innovation. Next. He argues that Italian immigrants were inventive creators. They weren't cultural conservatives. They were not trying to preserve traditions in cooking from their home communities. They did the creative work, he argues, of making an original material culture, even a symbolic narrative with these changing, shifting recipes. It was only a later group, he argues in the epilogue to this work, a later group of middle-class Italian immigrants who broke away from these immigrant origins of cooking and tried to relocate it within what he calls this authentic tradition of Italian cooking. Next. So what I'll do is to pick up on Simone's arguments about the alterations that were made in Italian cooking by the millions of Italian immigrants who arrived in the US between 1875 and 1930. I'll start with this recipe from Boni, this sfincione. This turns out to be a sfincione rosso. But what the heck, let me complicate this even further next, because I'll alter her recipe with another group of suggestions from another non-Italian group of cooks, the good folks at Cook's Country and America's Test Kitchen, who have their own ideas about this kind of cooking. And we'll start with the video.
Ciao. The good thing about this recipe is that it's quite easy. You don't have to be any kind of experienced cook for this. But there are two elements here that are important. One, you really do need a sturdy stand mixer because the dough that's created it's going to be very kneady, as you'll see. And the second thing you'll need is some patience because the dough itself is going to rise for 2 to 3 hours. So just prepare yourself for all of this. What I've done is to put into the stand mixer here 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour. And I'm going to add the first ingredients here. This is a teaspoon and a half of sugar and a teaspoon and a half of instant yeast, excuse me. And lock this in. Just for a couple of seconds, I'm going to mix those ingredients in. And that's enough of that. And the next step is a cup of warm water. And I'll slowly pour this in and the machine will run for about 2 minutes. Okay, this only ran for 2 minutes. And I stopped in the middle just to scrape the sides of the bowl. And step 1 is to just scrape your dough hook. Get that loose dough sitting there and cover this bowl for 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and take the next step. So that dough with the warm water sat for 7 to 8 minutes. Now I'm just going to add, how much salt did I have in here? I had 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and this is going to run again. And this is when you need a heavy duty mixer because this is going to go at medium and it's going to go for 7 to 8 minutes. Let's see how this looks. Yeah, that is elastic. And now place it onto a lightly floured countertop. Oh, look at that. And then just knead this for a while. So that's going to be placed in a pan like this. Now I put about a tablespoon of olive oil in it. Spread that around. Because we're going to, in a sense, fry this. And then I'm just going to spray the sides with olive oil as well. And this dough will now go into the pan. I'm going to cover that with plastic wrap, and that's going to sit for about 15 minutes. Next step with this, and we're not done yet. Next step with this is to take off that wrap. I'm going to spray this a bit with olive oil and spray my fingertips too. Because what I'm going to do is to start spreading out this very soft and pliable dough with my fingers into the corners of this pan. Looks like there's a lot of oil in there, but that's what you want for this Sicilian pizza. You want that bottom nice and crisp and fried. This is going to be covered again, and this time you'll leave it covered for 2 to 3 hours. And you can see how this rises so much, including this giant bubble, which is now going down. And now you're ready to top the pizzas. And the mozzarella is the first ingredient on here. What's nice about this style is that the mozzarella, as it melts, helps to keep the dough nice and soft. And then the next step is the sauce you'll use. Now here, I've got a 28-ounce can of San Marzano tomatoes. Unfortunately, this is one with the DOP insignia on it. It's genuinely from the region in Naples where these are grown. And to this, I'm going to add a bunch of seasonings. I've got some red pepper. I've got some salt and sugar, black pepper, garlic that I've minced, and some nutmeg. Try that. And I'll just add all of these to the can of San Marzano. So now I've hand crushed these. Sicilian olive oil, a bit more red wine, and finally, this is some dried Sicilian oregano. Just gonna push these leaves together, get some oregano out, add it to the sauce. The sauce varies quite a bit according to the kind of pizza you're making from this base. The classic Detroit pizza, which resembles this an awful lot, does just three horizontal strips of tomato sauce. But, you know, I got a full can of San Marzano tomatoes here, and it's delicious on this dish. And it allows me to cover not just the corners, but to get that delicious sauce everywhere. This would go into your oven at 500 degrees for about 15 minutes. But with this one, since it's a fairly nice day outside, I'm taking it out to a grill that's probably at about 650 degrees. And that's where we'll go next.
Well, before we go to that grill and the end of the recipe, I'd like to make a few other comments about my own pizza history. I grew up in an area of Brooklyn called Bensonhurst. It's in that south part of the borough, right at the entrance to New York Harbor, where we'd go to a park and watch ships come in and out. Just lovely to be in this area. Next, and in Bensonhurst, I was very fortunate, our whole family was fortunate, to live in the home that my Sicilian immigrant maternal grandparents bought for themselves and their family in 1944. The person on the upper right, Raimondo Santamaria, my maternal grandfather, arrived in 1921, worked manual labor with his brother Giuseppe until both of them in the mid-1920s got jobs at the Brooklyn Navy Yards as dock workers. And the woman on the left, Raymonda Buscemi, my maternal grandmother. They were married. Papa, unfortunately, left his wife in Italy in 21, came to America, made money in 24, brought her to the US. And in the lower right, it's the two of them in the early 1970s standing in front of the house that they were able to purchase. Next. This is just I'm always stunned by this story. This guy arrived in 1921 with $10. By 1944, he owned a house in Brooklyn. It was he had an accident on the docks, and it was an insurance settlement. Took a $4,000 check from that insurance settlement and put a down payment on this house. This is the way it looked in 1944. Next. And this is the way it looked later into the 21st century with some questionable house remodeling. Second floor, far right. Well, that's the bedroom that I shared with my brother Ray. Dan McInerney, named after my paternal Irish grandfather. Ray McInerney. Ray is named after our maternal grandfather. Next. We were lucky to have, a little bit of property on this in this house where 4 generations of the family lived. And Papa built himself a garden in the back where he planted his tomatoes and basil and oregano and his beloved fig tree. Next. And the pizzas we had were just, we just got used to having some of the best pizzas available. One of the great places for Neapolitan pizza was in Coney Island nearby at Totonno's, still open, and a coal-fired oven that New York City allows this restaurant to continue with. The originator of Totonno's in the upper left, Antonio Pero, he was the pizzaiola at Gennaro Lombardi's pizzeria that opened in 1895. Next. The premier Sicilian pizza down many blocks from our home was at L&B Spumoni Gardens. Opened in 1939. Our family has always gone there for generation after generation. Beautiful Sicilian style pizza, followed of course by a pistachio spumoni. Next. And the closest pizzeria where my father or my uncle would send me and my cousins down to get a couple of pizzas to go and just walk a couple of blocks to take them home was Lenny's Pizza on the main shopping drag. Now, Lenny's may not mean anything to most of you until you see something about Lenny's. And if you'd go ahead and click on that YouTube site, you'll see what Lenny's is famous for.
Two, give me 2, that's good.
That's our shopping block right there, 86th Street. By the way, that's also the street and the elevated subway where the famous chase scene in French Connection was filmed. Something for which the director did not get permits from the traffic authority in New York City. They just filmed that damn thing. Well, John Travolta came back for John Travolta Day in Brooklyn years later. Next, these wonderful pizzas in our area, the ones we could go to all the time. It's not surprising that, as one chef said, Brooklyn, as Southern Italians call it, has become the 21st region of Italy. Next. And as we all think about the importance of giving pizza a chance, let's go back to the video to watch what happens with the Sicilian pizza that I cooked up on a grill outside.
Okay, well, I've got the grill up to 650, and on the grill is a pizza stone, or if you have a pizza steel. Place that on there. It'll help make that bottom even crustier. At 650, I think I'm going to let this cook for about 10 minutes and then come out and check it. Okay, this is cooked for about 11 minutes at 650 degrees. And it looks like it's done. That's what it's like coming off the grill. And I'll put it inside, a couple more toppings, and then we'll start in. Also have some nice imported Pecorino Romano. I'm hoping this, oh yeah, beautiful. Basil. Loosening this up a bit. You can hear some of the crispiness already. Whoops, a bit of spillage, but there it is. Oh, that's coming together nicely. A nice bread knife is good to use on this. This, a Montalcino d'Abruzzo to go with it, and a nice pizza dinner.
Okay. Well, thanks to our presenters. Those were both really, really fun. I'm going to field Q&A now, unless, okay, no, yeah. So you can go ahead in the chat and shoot questions either right to me or just put them in general, and then I will present those to our esteemed presenters. So we'll do that for about 10 minutes, and then we'll call it good. Okay, just got our first question. I believe this is from Fran Titchener. Thank you, everyone. This is for Alex. Macronutrients and calorie density makes me think of the modern designation country style for things like cuts of meat. Do you see I don't think she meant to send it all right away. So we'll wait if the rest of that comes in, because the end of that question is cut off. My bad. I didn't read it all the way through before I started reading. I'm sorry, Fran and Alex and everyone. I jumped the gun. In the meantime, we will jump over to a question from Tammy, which is, why is the pan square, Dan?
I know why you're all hung up on geometry. What's important is not just the square dimensions of the pan, but its depth, because this dough is going to rise quite a bit, as a focaccia would rise, and you want it to fry not only on the base but also along the sides. So a kind of flat pan that you would use for a Neapolitan pizza just doesn't work for a traditional Sicilian, or for a sfincione in Palermo, in Bagheria, in Fagarazzi, wherever you are in Sicily itself. And yeah, that's as far as I think most Sicilians go into geometric issues.
That's wonderful. I too don't go very much into geometric issues, but I'm not Italian, let alone Sicilian. This next question is from Jamie Sanders. And I think this is just a general one, so we'll see who can field it. Probably best for Dan, since it's going to involve the tomato. This might have been answered earlier, but when did the tomato come to Italy? Obviously after the Columbian Exchange, but when did it become a significant part of the Italian diet?
there are a couple of answers to this that I found in doing some background research for this presentation. The story about the sfincione di San Vito prepared in a monastery traces the use of tomatoes back to the mid to late 17th century. But this was an item that was quite out of bounds for most Italian cooks and eaters until after World War II. That sfincione bianco in Bagheria is the kind of pizza-like dish, focaccia-like dish that most Sicilians would eat. Tomatoes tended to be expensive, and they don't come into wide use until the 20th century, and really until after the war, the Second World War. This is one of the reasons, though, why Chinotto, in his study of Italian-American foodways among US immigrants, why he talks about these cooks as people who were not seeking to preserve some kind of, quote, authentic recipe from Sicily. They were trying to celebrate the fact that they were not stuck within what's called a cucina povero, a cooking style of poverty. They were celebrating a cucina abbondanza, the abundance of foods, of tomatoes, of meats that they discovered they could afford in the US. And it's part of what has confused many Americans, even Italian Americans, about what one can expect to find in Italy. The classic illustration of this is spaghetti and meatballs with these gigantic round beef bombs that Americans were accustomed to. It's not something that you would traditionally find in Italy itself. And if you traditionally would go over there to order a pepperoni pizza, you'd usually wind up with a Neapolitan pizza and a plate of red peppers.
Thanks again, Dan. This question is from Evelyn Funda for Alex and Mark. We all want to know, why in the world is your second recipe called a placenta? What's the connection? Which comes first, the bread or the baby?
The bread. Yeah, that's a great question. So it actually comes from the Indo-European word or root plok, which means flat. And so basically what it was in Greek was placentas were little, or placentis were little flat cakes. And so you can't really tell in our little individual portion sized recipes, but this, like the actual recipe is this huge 6-pound thing that's like a disc. So it is flat and round. And so it was called that because it was this large flat cake of cheese and stuff. And then it became the placenta uterina, which is the uterine cake, which is how we got the medical term. So the bread did come first.
I think that's pretty sound life advice, really. Bread first, then babies. This is another question for you, Alex. This one's from Tammy. I'm curious about why feta was in both recipes. Was feta the major cheese or just one of many?
Yeah, so actually, it wasn't a feta that was in the original recipes. The original recipes was a sheep's cheese that would have been most similar in consistency to feta. It's sort of just like a dry, crumbly type of cheese is what was used most typically.
I was curious about the leavener. One of your breads had a leavener and then the placenta didn't have a leavener. So were leaveners common, and was yeast in fact the leavener that was used?
So it's not mentioned in the original like Latin texts at all. It's yeast isn't brought up, and but Mark Grant adds the leavener just to make the recipe a little more doable. And even with it, with the yeast and having it been proved twice, it still was like really hard to get it not to fall apart. I was actually really pleased that we got it not to fall apart in the video, because it was like the first time we did it, it was just like crumbly all over the place. But yeah.
I can actually, ironically, speak to that concept of yeast a little bit, because I've been baking lots of sourdough and got curious about the history of it. And leavening generally in history is all done like sourdough, wild yeast cultivation through water and flour. But as for what's in the recipe, yeah, to make it more doable, like Alex said, I don't know if they had leavening though, it would be that type of thing, and it would be looking at a pretty long rise, a rise that's a lot longer than. I actually don't know how long it rose in your video, Alex, but however long it was.
And I also had a question for Dan about the cheese. The cheese you mentioned in Bonnie's recipe, I'd never heard of, and I tried to copy it down really quickly. Caciocavallo, is that right? Oh, you're on mute. And what kind of cheese is that?
I actually found one of these last week when I was in an Italian market in Washington, D.C. And here in the U.S., it's a cow's milk cheese. And it's hung down from a rope. And it seems to have two parts to it, a thick bulbous part on the bottom and a narrower bulbous part where the rope is tied around. It's I made this with my brother Ray last week, and I thought it was a little sweeter than mozzarella. Now, in Italy, it's often a sheep's milk that's used, which has a different taste, of course. It's hard to find here in Utah, but in eastern Italian markets, and I guess on the West Coast too, it must be much easier to find. It's excuse me, it slices very nicely. It has a very light, delicate taste, and it's actually quite delicious. If I could also go back one couple of steps to the question from Jamie about tomatoes and Italian cooking. I said that the tomato becomes more popular in Italian cooking, especially after World War II. Let me take that back. It becomes more and more a part of Italian cooking by the early part of the 19th century, but not necessarily for most Italians who, again, especially in southern Italy, who are trapped within this cuisine for the poor, because it still can be an expensive food item to purchase. Again, by the later 19th century into the 20th century, it becomes more common. So one correction in what I said earlier about what I said earlier.
And if I could follow up on very briefly what Dan is saying, I think it's very interesting. In both of these recipes, there is a distinct lack of any kind of meat. And that, to a large extent, is because of how expensive that is. So our Roman ancestors, our Italian ancestors, were vegetarians, perhaps not by choice, but they were only allowed to have these kind of meat commodities on very special days. Isn't that right, Alex? That these meats were only part of their diet on holidays and that kind of on those kinds of occasions.
Yeah, and I would even add that on top of that, consuming too much meat was seen as like almost a moral failing, like an over excess and an overconsumption of meat was extravagant and morally reprehensible.
Well, you've just been reading too much Juvenal was your problem, right? Because you're just seeing it from the satirist perspective and taking all those rich people who can eat meat, and he can't. And that's really the problem, isn't it?
I see everything from a satirist perspective.
Well, I've trained you well.
Even those sfincioni I talked about, whether in Palermo or Bulgaria, They're often made for holidays religious holidays in December, on the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, December 7th, or Christmas Eve. But even then, extraordinarily rare to put any kind of meat on these. Even in this big holiday feast, these are vegetarian items, and they still remain so in most of Sicily. It's again only when Americans get hold of these things that they start plopping in all that meat that they can find so abundantly in the New World.
So how is it that we associate pepperoni with Italy? Come on, Dan.
Oh, Italians have pepperoni. It's red peppers.
I see it as meateroni, because if it's just peppers, it ain't pepperoni. Okay, I mean, let's get the name right here, right?
There's a lot
Okay.
of. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, no, I was just gonna say, I think we're at time, so I think we're gonna wrap up. But I do want to let all our guests know that we will be having 2 more episodes in the spring. So make sure you. Oh, thank you. In January, we'll be doing Cooking with a Conscience, and in February, we'll be doing Survival Cooking. We don't have the full details for either of those yet, but they sound so intriguing. I know you'll all want to come back and join us, and we'll make sure you can get the information for that on all our social media channels. So thank you guys for coming. Now I think I need to go eat a snack. And we'll see all the rest of you next semester. Thanks a bunch.